Well, tonight we are going to discuss the Great Depression, 1929 to about 1935.
100 years ago.
Well, possibly. And then we're going to try to draw correlations with 2025. 96 years later. Now, most people, including I assume most people at this table, think the Great Depression was a consequence of the New York stock market crash. It was not. The stock market crashed in July 1929, and by the end of 1929 it had recovered fully anything that was lost 6 months previously. So, what was the Great Depression? And why did it have such a profound impact on Australia? Australia was one of the countries that had one of the most profound impacts. 1/3 of the male population had a work. 10% of mortgages were foreclosed. Wages fell. Social protests increased. Both the trade unions were progressives and the right secret society. So it had a profound impact. So what we need to do is we need to go back to the steps to understand the Great Depression and what happened to things. Don't just talk about the reason why in 2025 you can make history out of it. So what happened? Federation, 1901. Very Federation in 1901 was touch and go.
That could be Lewis just going around and walk Lewis the shit.
So Federation was touch and go. The citizens of New South Wales did not want to federate with the losers in other states because they felt if they federated, they would have to support the small states. So it took 2 referendums in New South Wales for them to agree to federation. So what happened during the 10-year process towards federation of the different states, about the principles that federation were based on became smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So when federation occurred in 1901, the central government had minimal power. Today, the federal government has extraordinary powers. Although if you remember COVID-19, state governments found they still have extraordinary power. So with federation, state governments still had the power to tax. They raised taxation net revenue. It wasn't until after World War II that the federal government received the power through the referendum to collect taxation. So what you had is that the federal government was relying on 3 things: excise duties, customs duties, and a little bit of land tax. So it's a minimal income stream. So power lay to a significant degree in the various state governments. And this is very important to remember when we talk about the Great Depression, because most of the things we take for granted today, like a social security net, came as a result of the referendum in 1949, which transferred the power of taxation from the state to the federal government, right? And that led to the introduction of a viable social security system. So before the Depression, the responsibility to provide for people who are out of work, for people who are marginalised, people who are poor, rested on the state government, as well as private charities, community support, and your own support. There was no federal government support. So when COVID-19, the legislation was introduced, people's pensions went up. There was people financially, many people found themselves in a better situation. They couldn't move around, but financially they were in a good situation in comparison, especially people on social security benefits. But in the first 40 years of the Federation, central government had minimal power because of minimal taxation revenue. Now, at the same time, we had World War I. Now, World War I had a profound impact on Australia, more so than even Europe. About 25 million people died in Europe, most of them soldiers. The fact is that out of a population of 5 million, 420,000 young and middle-aged men volunteered to fight in the Great War, the war to end the war, the war fought by workers at either end of the bayonet, basically. Almost 5% of the population, the working population, is 420,000. So why did people volunteer? They volunteered because they were promised things, like pensions when they came back, money when they came back, jobs when they came back, education when they came back. That's if they came back. Now of that 420,000, 62,000 died of European killing fields. And of those that returned, another 60,000 died of their war wounds within a decade of returning. So this is having a profound impact on Australian society, where you've got a whole generation which basically is responsible for working and keeping society functioning has disappeared. And those that have come back, half of that generation are either chronically incapacitated or they die. Okay. Now between 1914 and 1921, Australian per capita income dropped by 16%. People talk about hard times in 2025. This is a huge drop in per capita income. It dropped by 16%. Why did it drop? And the population dropped as well because of the deaths. So why did we find ourselves in this situation? One word, two words: war debt. Right? Wars aren't fought with an empty, purse. You need money to fight wars. At this particular point in time, Australia borrowed heavily from the United Kingdom to finance the war effort. And only 15% of the revenue which was raised by the government issuing war bonds increased interest rates and interest in terms of returns to the investors. And the slogan was, invest in the war and make a buck out of it, make a profit. No hassles, right? So you've got the war bonds are only responsible for 15% of the cost. The rest of the cost came from borrowings from the London financial sector, who borrowed from the United States. England borrowed over $1 billion, which seems nothing today, but that's an extraordinary amount, close to $1 trillion today. So you've got this debt Congo line. We borrow from the United Kingdom, they borrow from the United States. By the end of World War I, the United States had 60% of the gold in the world in its vaults, because at that particular point in time, the world economy was based on the gold standard. What that meant is that gold was used as a guarantee for national debt. Right? So if you borrowed, you had to give gold to the borrower as a guarantee. But at the same time, you still had to pay that money back and you had to pay interest on it. Now, politically, there were huge upheavals in Australia during World War I. The Labor Party split on the question of conscription. 2 conscription plebiscites rejected conscription, And Billy Hughes took one-third, the leader of the Labor Party, took one-third of the Labor Party across the chamber to join the National Party, and they formed a coalition government during the war. Now, when the war ended, it had all these soldiers who returned to Australia, and they respected a reward for their efforts. And the government of the day was forced, because of increased dissatisfaction among returned servicemen mainly, and a few returned service nurses. The Australian government had promised and was forced to deliver war pensions, set up a repatriation system, at one stage actually paid returned soldiers. They set up soldier settlements. They set up free education for returned soldiers. So returned soldiers were important, and they were important in terms of their ability to change parliamentary policy. For example, they were an unruly mob. You've got to remember, these were volunteers. The English government wanted the power to execute soldiers who didn't, went AWOL. The Australian government refused, because they were volunteers. So when they came back, they were an unruly mob, because of there were 17 Australian soldiers in prison for every one soldier from the Empire. Could you imagine that? And if you look at Australian history overseas, the riots that soldiers were involved in, the looting, the raping, Australian soldiers were at the forefront of a lot of this stuff, especially in Egypt. So they get back, there's no work, they're getting a bit toey. The government was trying to establish the soldier settlement scheme to get single men out of the cities into the country. It's trying to provide pensions, delivered income. Now, Billy Hughes is famous for going off at the Treaty of Versailles, where he claimed that Australia was owed $457 million in repatriation from the defeated Germans, Austro-Hungarians and Turks. Billy Hughes came back with $5.7 million. At the same time, they had to pay this debt. Right? Australians called it a blood debt, but as you know, dead men and women do not pay taxes. But you need to pay that interest. So in post-World War I, in the 20s, Australia was faced with the problem of servicing the war debt. And 15% of every dollar that was raised by the federal government went towards paying interest on the war debt. Not just the original sum, but interest on the war debt. Now, there was pressure in England for the Australian government to cough up, because in the interim, in order to maintain stability, I'll give you an example of how volatile things work. In July, I forgot the exact date, 1919, there was a big celebration to mark the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. The Australian returned service men, soldiers and sailors went on a riot through the streets of Melbourne. One soldier was shot dead by the police, who freely used their batons to try to contain the riot. The soldiers demanded, and by that time they had banded an organisation called the Returned Sailors and Soldiers Imperial League of Australia, which was a forerunner to the Returned Service. Right? They demanded a meeting with the police commissioner, who refused. So the soldiers went to Parliament House, rifled every cupboard in the Victorian Parliament House, and even the Premier, Sir Harry Wilson, not the Labor Henry Wilson, Sir Harry Wilson, was hit in the back of the head by an inkwell by a disgruntled soldier. So this is real violence on the streets of Melbourne. So in order to placate the returned servicemen, what they had to do is buy more money from the British authorities in the 1920s to set up the soldier settlement schemes, to set up the pension scheme, to set up a repatriation scheme, to pay a gratuity to return servicemen. So the country slid into more debt. So when the New York stock market collapsed in 1929, what happened was that the money supply began to run out. The London financial institutions were not able to borrow money from the United States financial institutions because the stock market collapsed, and they called in their debts. So most of the other parts of the empire, like Canada, India, had paid off their debt, but we hadn't. We hadn't, because our soldiers were volunteers and they demanded recompense for their sacrifices. So the government of the day, which was led by Stanley Bruce, went on a campaign, this is before 1929, before the Depression, went on a campaign to reduce wages and to increase unemployment. And they went on this campaign where they attacked the miners, seamen, whatever. It was really vicious struggle. Those of you who know your history remember the miners' strike at Port Melbourne, where Alan Whittaker, a returned Gallipoli serviceman, was shot dead by Victorian police on the piers in the mid-20s. So there was this huge debate in the community. Now Stanley Bruce, obviously was a Conservative politician, who was very keen to start repaying the debt. If you're a government and you've got minimal income, you repay the debt by attacking the trade unions, decreasing wages, firing people, and the list goes on and on. Now this caused a lot of problems, a lot of riots. It happened in 1929. The Australian people handed a poisoned chalice to the Australian Labor Party, and the Australian Labor Party under Mr. Scullin was elected in the middle of 1949. I think it's 6 weeks before the stock market collapsed in New York. Right? So they were faced with this impossible task. And the question was, do we repay the interest, or does Australia default on its debt to the United Kingdom and eventually the United States? And the Scullin Labor Party decided, the Federal Party decided, that they would attempt to repay the debt. The London financiers came across to Australia to look at the situation, said Australia was living in cloud cuckoo land, because what had happened at the end of World War II and the introduction of agricultural tariffs around the world is that agricultural production increased. As agricultural production increased, Australian exports decreased. So income was decreasing rapidly, and our major exports at that stage were agricultural. So the government is faced with a dilemma. It's got the financial vultures on its neck, right? It's got a population that living standards have fallen, and it's got a government authorities from London, the London Bank, saying that the country needs to devalue. We've all heard of inflation. Deflation is a very nasty business. What deflation means is that prices fall. As prices fall, companies fold. Unemployment increases. So the federal government under Scullin decided to pursue a deflationary policy post the drying up of funds in 1930. At the same time, the New South Wales government, which was under Jack Lang, a Labor Party member, decided to go on a different course, and that course was to default on the debt. So you had a federal government which wanted to pay off the debt, and the biggest state government of Jack Lang Labor, it's called Jack Lang Labor Party, wanted to default on the debt, right? So what happens is that during this period, as the economy collapses, unemployment increases dramatically. By 1930, 1 in 3 adult men was unemployed. As you all know, the old adage, 6 weeks without pay in a system which is based on the wage economy means poverty. You lose everything. Now the banks did all they could, believe it or not, for the first time. They did all they could to prevent defaults on mortgages. But still 10% of houses defaulted on their mortgages. Now remember, I said there is no social security net. They are relying on private charities, local councils to fill the gap, to provide support and food. Now obviously, these organisations are overwhelmed because of the mass of the problem, because of the extent of the problem. This is a mass problem, right? So we had things introduced like sustenance, work for the dole, which meant working on so-called structural projects. All these were introduced to try to placate people. But the most evil part was the fact that single men were denied any assistance unless they left the cities and went round the country looking for work. And every week they could go to a police station to get sustenance. You know, sugar, flour. So you've got this army of single men roaming the country, you know, going from town to town to town to get their sustenance. Because the idea was, well, if you're single, you know, you should be looking for work. So you had all the things we talk about now about dole bludgers, leaners, which is part and parcel. Now, the important thing is that as unemployment increased, social resistance increased. We've got an unemployed workers movement, which was quite powerful in terms of organising protests. Now, the returned soldiers and sailors broke up into 2 factions. Those that were trade unionists and those that were imperialists, you know, who wanted the empire to continue and supported the empire. Usually you found that a lot of the officer classes were part of that, right? So you've got this, you've got to remember, in Europe, we're seeing profound changes. We saw the rise of Mussolini in the early 20s, we saw the rise of the Nazi Party taking power in 1933. We saw the rise of, sectarianism, hatred across Europe because of the same issues. But in Australia, somehow, those so-called representative democratic institutions continue to function, although there are assaults from the trade union movement and the imperial forces. So what happened is, between 1930 and 1933, is that there are a number of movements arose in the country, which most of you are aware of. There's unemployment mass movement, which mobilised people on the dole and sustenance for better conditions. Because people were living in work camps where there were no basic essentials of any kind. You know, you went into the bush to have a shit, and at the end of the week you got, your sustenance. That's why it's called sustenance, the dole. You know, it's doled out to you. People forget where these words come. The sustenance is doled out to you. So the unemployed workers movement became stronger and stronger across the country. The Australian Communist Party emerged during this period, over 1921, and they became stronger and stronger because of the situation. At the same time, the imperialist forces became stronger and stronger, and the government itself became weaker and weaker, because once a government is no longer able to provide for a significant part of the population, that's when you have disruption, right? So how did this disruption occur? It occurred in a number of ways. It occurred in the anti-eviction movement. Landlords had a problem. They had to pay the banks. Right? Most of the money was borrowed. If they tried to evict families, especially families, the anti-eviction movement mobilised people to basically go across to the real estate agents and pressure them, who would then pressure the landlord to not evict the family, because if they evicted the family, they'd trash the house and there'd be nothing left. And that's what used to happen. In Burnley, in 1931, when a family was Burnley down the road, when a family was evicted, every real estate agent in Richmond and Melbourne had their windows smashed. At the same time, especially in Bankstown in New South Wales and Redfern, the anti-eviction movement became stronger and stronger with hundreds of people. But what happened is the police began to use live fire. When they raided these houses, they would shoot into the house first, then raid the house. People who were arrested were jailed for up, beaten up and jailed for up to 12 months. There's one interesting thing. You know, everybody says that everybody has forgotten Eureka. The fact is, one of the strongest holdouts in Bankstown was called the Eureka Stockade. Just out of interest. It's called the Eureka Stockade. So people understood, but it was quite violent. And this is during the period of Jack Lang. At the same time, you've got the trade unionists and social progressives, the Australian Communist Party, other socialist groups, trying to maintain some sense of equilibrium in the community. You have the growth of secret armies. This is the period of the kangaroo, what we call the kangaroo armies setting up the kangaroo courts. Apologies, I don't know what they to deserve this. But what happened is, I'll give you an example. In Victoria, the secret army was called the White Army. And two of the leaders of the White Army, you'll find this very interesting. One was Thomas Blamey, who was the Chief Police Commissioner. And the other leader was a guy called Edward Harris, who became the Chief Justice of Victoria after the Depression. So these are the type of individuals that I'm saying are attracted to this paramilitary organisation. And these are organisations which are armed. They conducted attacks, like on the anarchist Mattioli clubs, which they tried to shut down. They would come around and try to shut down these more radical, progressive organisations. They had over 30,000 members by 1930s. This is Victoria alone. Many of them were returned service soldiers and sailors who had military experience and had the, were not averse to using a bit of violence and firearms to get their own way. At one stage, they needed a figurehead who was, admired by the public. So they approached, that's the Chief Police Commissioner of one of the justices, approached Sir John Monash to lead the army. And to his credit, he refused. He says, we've got structures, democratic structures in this country, we'll be able to resolve these issues, and I refuse to be involved in a conspiracy. So that lost them a little bit of credibility. In New South Wales, remember I said Jack Lang and the Labor Party were attempting to default on the New South Wales debt. Now we had a group which was called the Old Guard, which was a conservative mishmash, but in 1941 they set up the New Guard. Now the New Guard was a really nasty underground conspiracy. Nasty. Fully armed. They used to give fascist salutes at their rallies. They'd have mass rallies. They'd have their own insignia. They'd march around the place, acting as bodyguards. They would, at the same time, the Australian trade union movement formed the. And I think at one stage the New Guard had over 50,000 members, that's active members who were ready for a takeover. So what happened is eventually in 1932, Jack Lang, the Premier, was booted out. Guess by who? The governor. The governor. And once Lang left, he was booted out. The reason for these groups kind of dissipated and they dissipated. But they were a really powerful paramilitary force which was supported by powerful elements, both financially and politically, in the system. So we had our own fifth column in this country in the 30s. Now what happened to people? let's not forget that the Depression is about people. And the people who suffer during an economic downturn are those who have the least margin, those who lead a hand-to-mouth existence, those who are on a wage system. These are the people who suffer the most. So what happened? Well, we had these huge soup kitchens which were established to feed people, mainly by private charities. Some of the pictures. We had itinerant travellers who put all their stuff on a wagon and a horse and travel from town to town every week trying to get sustenance. We had huge groups of homeless people squatting around us. Squatting became a mechanism by which we had itinerants catching, jumping onto trains, railway goods carriages in order to get from place to place. And we had a police force who was not only the police force, but they were also entrusted to provide susso to the people who were wandering around the country who required assistance. So you had the situation, you had the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And the problem was that so many people were so marginalised, they were in no position to revolt. For example, people say to me and other people who do the vigil for public housing, every Thursday from 12 to 1, where are the public housing tenants? And I'm saying, well, if you're a public housing tenant, you'd be a fool to be on the steps of the Victorian Parliament House, unless there's a huge number of you. Because if you're an individual, there is the very real prospect that you will lose your security. And if you're on a fixed income, like a social security benefit, and you lose your home, then you're up to crap. As it was the same during the Depression. Many of the people who were most marginalised were those who basically accepted their life and were in no position to revolt because the cost, you've got to talk about a period where there's no contraception, big families, you're responsible for your food's at a premium, although very few people are starved in Australia because of day-to-day struggle. Accommodations are premium, you can't get work, there's all the psychological issues related to that, there's an increase in violence in the community. So you've got all these issues you're dealing with. So the Scullin Labor Party is in a quandary. Do they default on the debt, or do they continue to pay the interest? And they decided, as I said before, to pay the interest, which led to deflation, which led to increased unemployment, which led to all these other social issues which occurred. The federal government was not in a position to provide a safety net because of limited income, so things became worse and worse and worse. And it wasn't until about 1935 that a lot of the problems had been temporarily ameliorated, and it wasn't until 1939, with the outbreak of World War II, that things improved, believe it or not. So what happened to Mr. Scullin? Well, Mr. Scullin and Mr. Lyons, who was John Lyons, were both members of the Labor Party. And the Labor Party once again split on the question of what to do about the debt. And what happened was that Mr. Lyons formed the United Australia Party, which swept the elections at the end of 1943. Okay, so politically, stability. The paramilitary groups dissipated. Things began to improve once the money locker was unlocked. And Australia was actually able to access finance. So it raises interesting questions. Nothing happened. So let's look at 2025. Okay, what's the difference? The first thing is we've got a federal government that has strong economic economic base. It has a monopoly on taxation. The states no longer are responsible for taxation. So that's one of the major differences. Every government has taxation revenue and they can borrow money out of thin air because Mr. Scullin, one thing he did, I've forgotten this, was to actually remove Australia from the gold standard. So, to remove Australia from the gold standard, which means that economically they're a bit more free. So, second, well, by 1937, everybody left the gold standard. Yeah, everybody thinks we've got a gold standard that, for every dollar we borrow, there's some gold that No. What happened is the US dollar became the gold standard, not gold. That's the difference, all right? The US dollar. Yeah, well, the gold standard. Well, no, they said, well, we need a currency to which other currencies can be based on, and it became the US dollar, not gold. That's why the US dollar even today is so important in terms of trade negotiations, because negotiations are based on US dollars, although a lot of countries are trying to get out of that type of situation. But going back, so the second thing is we've got a social security net. Right? While income comes in, we have a social security net. The thing we don't have is a strong trade union movement and a strong progressive and extra parliamentary movement. It has never been so weak as it is in 2025. The progressive movement, extra parliamentary movement, the trade union movement. So it's quite relatively easy, as we saw for the deregistration, whatever, CFMU, it is quite easy for governments to put downward pressure, on wages because of a lack of collective bargaining among trade unions. So although we've got taxation revenue, the federal government, and we've got a social security net, there is no protection. And as we move into 2025 and we see the rise of a movement which is based on division and hatred, as we saw during the Depression, well, guess who were the targets of the imperial immigrants? Between 1921 and 1930, 300,000 immigrants were brought into Australia. And why were they brought into Australia? All the young men were dead, or rioting, or injured. And they needed to replenish the supply. This is when you get the stories about the orphanages being emptied in England and the little attackers sent down here to be exploited. This is the time when they allowed Italians, believe it or not, until 30,000 Italians, 10% of the migrants. This is the time when there were these beautiful advertisements in cold, old England and possibly Ireland, which is pale, where you had beautiful pictures of sunny Australia, and people were brought across on assisted passages, and they were put into substandard farms in Shepparton, Tongara, around sun-drenched. It didn't take them long to realise. So immigrants were a great target, and obviously, and also you've got the usual, First Nations camp to kick down the road, but you couldn't kick that down the road too much in 1930s because they were considered to be a vanishing race. They were just going to die out because people were basically French to others. So there are the usual suspects in this situation. So going back to today, I just want to draw parallels. One, government has taxation revenue, which can support a social security system. Government has become quite powerful because of the destruction of the trade union, social and progressive movements. We may think we're some type of mass movement. We're not. We're a pimple, on society's arse. You've got less than 12% of workers are actually in trade unions, and most of those workers are in trade unions because they have to be in order to get work in that particular industry. There is legislation in place that makes striking illegal outside of the bargaining agreement period. So we've got weak governments, weak progressive movements. At the same time, we've got a growing movement that is based on division and hatred, whether it's against people with gender identity, because of their race, because of their religion, whatever. We see Mr. Button trying to push, I'm sorry for this tautology. I know, you know what's coming. Mr. Button trying to push the button, on all these. It hasn't been successful today, but in a period of increasing unemployment, it can be exceptionally successful to blame the other. So, financially, what's our problem? Australia's problem is that we have not changed since the 1920s. We are an export-orientated society. Most of the taxation revenue outside personal taxation and limited company tax, which is only about 15% of taxation revenue, comes from royalties and taxation on the export of mineral wealth and agricultural production. In a period of increasing tariffs, we will see that agricultural exports will decrease. In a period where we're changing from a fossil fuel economy to a renewable energy economy, most of the exports we have, like coal and iron ore and gas, will become irrelevant. We have a minuscule manufacturing base. Our economy is based on local consumption, most of which is imported. It's about consumption and services. That's our economy at the minute. So if there is a downturn